Ladies and gentlemen, what would an open borders world look like? Well, in the last 10 years, the Australian government has spent more than $15 million on advertising campaigns designed to deter prospective migrants from coming to Australia. Now, many of these advertisements read as follows: "No way, you will not make Australia your home." Quote. Similar flyers were found in migrant shelters in Mexico near the border with the US. Now imagine what all of that money, what all of that $15 million in Australia could have been spent on. It could have been spent on schools. It could have been spent on hospitals and healthcare. But no, it was spent on deterring migrants from coming to Australia. And similar attempts have been seen, as I said, near the American border and near other borders in European countries, in Hungary, for example. We have seen indeed a plethora of similar initiatives all over the world. The hostile tone of these advertisements has been significantly criticized. But there's no denying that if a politician or a political party was to openly stand up and say, "I am in favor of relaxing the rules of immigration, I am in favor of liberalizing immigration," that would no doubt be more or less political suicide, which is why no politician or no political party in Europe, bar maybe a few minor politicians and parties, dare to do such a thing. Even the Labour Party in my home country in the United Kingdom does not dare state that they believe in liberalizing immigration, because they know that they would never get into power if they stated that they wanted to open the borders of the United Kingdom. Left-wing parties in European countries are no longer stating that immigration is a positive thing. So the question remains then, what would an open borders world look like? Or is received wisdom in Europe and in the world correct? Is immigration simply a bad thing? Do we just need to restrict immigration? Well, an economist from George Mason University called Bryan Caplan has been wondering exactly the same question. A few years ago, he made a radical pro-immigration argument, stating essentially that he was in favor of nearly unrestricted immigration. And that was the subject of a new graphic non-fiction book that he published in 2020, I think. Caplan sees immigrants not as threats, but as generators of wealth. And that completely informs his whole perspective on immigration. He based this book around the predictions of a development economist called Michael Clemens. Now, Michael Clemens estimated that global freedom of movement would increase the gross world product by between 50% and 150%. So we're talking here about an increase in global GDP of between 50% and 150%. That is not to be sneered at. And the basic principle espoused by Caplan and by Michael Clemens is that workers in poor countries are an underutilized resource. I mean, his point is, how productive can you really be in a country like Haiti, for example? It doesn't matter how many skills you have. You will not get the opportunity to put those skills to good use. Now, Caplan doesn't advocate for abolishing borders entirely. In fact, he believes that countries should still be allowed to issue passports and maintain territorial notions of belonging. But he argues that once basic criminal background checks have been run on immigrants, they should automatically be accepted at all standard points of entry into various countries. He argues that all of these new consumers would stimulate the economy. He takes the example of the American economy, which may be a bit different to European economies, but nevertheless, the principles are more or less the same. He thinks that if immigrants were allowed to just come into the US, they would stimulate the economy to such a significant degree. He argues that governments should relinquish their exclusionary authority so that anyone could accept a job offer, regardless of their citizenship. And he also argues that big businesses would benefit considerably from this expanded labor pool. According to Caplan, immigrants represent a net fiscal benefit to the US government. And he may be right actually, because according to data from the National Academy of Sciences, the average new arrival in the US generates around $259,000 annually in tax revenue. The data also shows that American-born citizens actually tend to impose a larger fiscal burden on the state than immigrants, and also American-born citizens tend to be more likely to commit crimes than immigrants, which completely blows out the water myths relating to crime rates or increases in crime rates caused by immigrants. But he argues that it's not just about economics. He argues that it's also about morals and philosophy. According to Caplan, borders perpetuate a global apartheid. And he says that the idea behind borders is to essentially exclude people on the basis of their nationality, on the basis of the country that they happened to be born into. He argues that excluding people on the basis of the country that they happened to be born into is no less reprehensible than discrimination on the grounds of gender, race, or religion. For, after all, according to Caplan, the country that you happen to be born into is an external factor. It shouldn't determine who you are, and nobody, after all, ever had a say in which country they were born into. He argues that we are right to value equality of opportunity, but he argues that if we truly value equality of opportunity at home, then it should be valued more on a global scale. Because equality or inequality is much starker, he argues, on a global scale. He makes the point that we often conclude that global inequalities are simply the result of vast historical forces that we can't expect to change. We often think of global inequalities as completely inevitable. And that's often why we see inequalities within countries as far more morally urgent than inequalities between countries. But he argues that this isn't a zero-sum game at all. The two are not mutually exclusive. It's not a question of dealing with homegrown inequality at the expense of dealing with global inequality or vice versa. He actually argues that opening up the world's borders is the right thing to do financially, because that would actually give the global economy 75 trillion extra dollars, but it's also the right thing to do morally. So in conclusion, this is not necessarily my point of view, but I chose to talk about this today because I think it is always useful and salutary to question received wisdom. And it seems concerning that the dominant narrative at the moment in Europe and in the world is that immigration is simply a bad thing and that it needs to be restricted. And I've chosen to talk about this because I think it's useful to question that hypothesis. Thank you very much for listening.